So, hello everybody once again. I need to tell you that I'm not very well today. I will do my best, but if I have to run out to the bathroom, I'll be back soon, and I've asked Nikolai to keep you entertained while I'm out, but I'll probably be able to stay. Today, I want to talk about sexuality, and the theme is sexuality, drive, and relationship. I think this is a really important subject and important to think about and teach about and learn about. It's a subject which, of course, can bring a lot of excitement, but also a lot of anxiety. And all of that seems to me quite appropriate. So apart from all the obvious experiences, possibilities, and dangers inherent in our sexual desires and activities, the theme of sexuality raises many important theoretical and therapeutic questions. So I want to share my understanding of sexuality and its place in psychotherapy, and in particular in Gestalt therapy. But what I would like you to do, first of all, is to get a sense of yourself as you sit here as part of this webinar as a sexual being, as somebody presumably who knows what it feels like to be involved in sexual encounters. And maybe notice what a different state of being that is from the one that we usually enact sitting in here and talking to each other. It's much more instinctual. It's much more full of experience and much less full, hopefully, of thinking and planning and cognition. It is much more animal event, something that we share with all other animals that have sexual expression and sexual reproduction. And that animal basis for sexuality is something I will talk about a lot. But what I want to do, first of all, is face head on what I would call the trouble with Fritz Perls. We have a strange history concerning sex, particularly around our main founder, Fritz Perls. And in looking at and facing this history, I have come to some interesting conclusions that support my work in the area of sex and sexuality. I think the story of Fritz and sexuality is both more complex and significant than it seems. First of all, Fritz Perls was initially trained as a psychoanalyst. And psychoanalysis has a special place for sex as the prototypical drive which underlies much of our activity, either directly or through sublimation into other expressions. So in psychoanalysis, that drive, that id drive, faces the superego demands of a sexually repressive society, where its direct expression becomes taboo and the ego develops as a referee of the struggle. Fritz Perls saw it differently, and I'll talk about that later. Another aspect of Perls's psychoanalytic training was his analysis with Wilhelm Reich, who was equally known as a sexual transgressor, and yet was at the same time held in high regard by Freud. Yet, even with that background in psychoanalysis and of the central significance of the sexual drive, Fritz Perls didn't, it seems to me, think of sex as very important. That might seem like an unusual thing to say, but the analogy I use is that I'm willing often to go for a meal with people in groups that I run, and I don't believe that it usually gets in the way of my therapeutic or training relationship to people. Fritz Perls saw sex as a drive similar to hunger, a purely natural drive or lack that needs fulfilling. And he saw no contradiction between being someone's therapist and having sex with them outside the therapy. And that comes across to me as saying that it wasn't a very important thing to him. It didn't have a very important impact on the relationship. And as far as I've discovered, when he was actually doing therapy, he didn't generally touch his clients. He was much more physically held back, even if at some later time he would be having sex with them. The other significant consideration for Fritz was that he was not a socially minded man and was never off duty. So he would have had very little opportunity to meet women who were not clients or trainees. It is difficult to imagine him in his local bar or sports club or book club or other places where people meet potential partners. So he essentially had to either find his sexual partners among the people he worked with, or he had to be celibate. And once again, his sex drive didn't take him out into the world. He basically brought into that the people who were close, who were easy to find, and because of his fame, were quite willing to offer themselves for sex. And I've had that experience when I've gone to teach, but I took a different decision because sex is important to me. So then, as is often the case, Gestalt therapy develops as a kind of reaction formation to what Fritz did sexually. And I think we could borrow psychoanalytics terminology and say that we are still, as a group of Gestalt therapists, in our Oedipal phase in a very powerful and unaware way, and very often in discussions and writing and presentations, there is a ritual killing of the father. But now, in this reaction formation, it seems as if the whole idea of any instinctual drive has been pushed out of Gestalt therapy and theory in favor of relationship and dialogue. It has become a truism to say that therapy is about the lived body, Körper in German, rather than the physical body, Leib, and the phenomenal world rather than the physical world. And so, to my mind, has reproduced the Cartesian mind-body split that Pearls and Goodman were so keen to move away from. The human animal, with its appetites, skin, and genitalia, is gone. So we are left with a cerebral version of sexuality, which has lost its rawness and danger. The primary sexual organ is then the brain and our narrative capacity. We have been skinned and castrated. As we would expect from the theory of creative indifference of Friedlander, there is a similar problem with the opposite pole in Pearl's formulation, which has no challenge to it. Sex becomes simply an impulse-fulfilling activity with little concern from either partner beyond the pleasures of the moment. So I think it is useful for Gestaltists to go back and revisit the important place that Freud allocated to sex. I'm far more with Freud than with Pearls about this. So I see a dialectic between drive and relationship. And I wrote an article about drive theory in relation to Gestalt therapy, because it certainly was mentioned in Pearls, Hefferlein, and Goodman. So what I wrote was, it is the drive theory that states that the body, the physical being, has its own requirements for survival, contact, and procreation, and that these, while being object-seeking, are more geared to the satisfaction of a hunger than to the specificity of the object. I need to eat, even if the food is not tasty. I need parental attachment, even if the attachment comes at a high price. I need people to connect to, even if the only people around me require me to submit to pain and frustration. I lust for sex and gravitate towards those who might provide it, though I might conceal that attraction behind moral condemnation and other sublimations. At root, we are animals with all the instinctual drives which an animal and a species needs to survive. If sex was not a powerful drive, our species would have disappeared in the normal course of evolution. This is not saying the same as saying that the purpose of sex is a continuation of species. An argument which is often made against any sex that does not lead to procreation, gay sex, contraception, masturbation, etc. Evolution does not have a single purpose in that way. All it requires is enough procreative sex to continue the species. However, we have also evolved the more complex human ability to organize and shape our lives, develop relationships and cultures, and live in a world of meanings. Both these abilities coexist, residing to some extent in the two hemispheres of our brains. And the meaning of being human is in the interaction between the two, rather than in one or the other. I think this is really important because Gestalt therapy has moved backwards and forwards between a very physicalized therapy and being a very much more cognitive, conceptual therapy. And what's lost is the fact that we combine both, and there is an interaction and a tension between them. Just like the, and connected to, that we are both very socially adept animals, part of our social field, and at the same time, at any moment, able to say, no, I'm not going this way anymore, I'm going that way, and taking our individual steps away from the consensus. And once again, to hold one or the other, individualism or anti-individualism, loses the most important thing, which is the dialectic and the tension between those two. So in particular, our sexual relating involves at a very high level both our animal instincts and our human creativity and story making. At various times, one or other of these will be more figural or even excluding of the other. The human difference, what will not be easily captured by artificial intelligence, is not one or other of these, but what emerges from the interplay between our drives and our creativity and meaning making. At times, these can enhance each other, while at times they can get in each other's way. And sex is a perfect example of this. The experience of sex can be enhanced by our ability to invent new possibilities physically and to communicate our interests and preferences to our partners. Our ability to invent contraceptive methods takes away anxiety around pregnancy. However, anxiety around pregnancy also resides in this side of sex, which is also the foundation for the whole of romantic literature, where culture or meaning gets in the way of sexual desire, or sexual desire wins out over culture, and then people have to face the effect on their lives of what the cultural environment makes of their sexual expression. So with this in mind, I primarily today want to focus on sexuality, which I would understand as the drive or instinctual aspect of sex. Sexuality is the power, the battery behind sex, the raw attraction that takes our breath away and makes it more difficult to think or speak. It is the foundation onto which the complexity of sex is built. It operates not by words, but by body response. Increased heart rate and skin color, eye dilation, enlargement of genitals and breasts, and smell, pheromones, all of which we are geared to be aware of in other people without any words needing to be spoken. Sexuality has no ethical principles or concerns beyond the moment, and most certainly has no interests in safe sex, which is not a support for species procreation and survival, and it has no interest in romance. Sexuality does not involve concepts, including the concepts of I am male or female, I am straight or gay or bisexual. In sexuality, I am attracted to the person I'm attracted to, animal to animal, and to taking the sexual actions that come with that attraction. So, for me as a man, I can have a sexual response in situations which are absolutely not appropriate, and that response might be visible. So it's only once that sexuality is in place that the other, to quote, higher functions and ethical values come in, which then either enhance or inhibit our sexual possibilities. And yet it seems to me that the higher functions are culturally so privileged in our time that they have become the definition of sexuality rather than a secondary shaping of our sexual relating. Our clothes and the artificial smells we put on our bodies become the essence of our desirability and our sexual signaling. Our clothes are our body. Our perfume and aftershave are our smell. Sex becomes an expression of our masculinity or femininity, or societies or advertisers' fantasies and narratives. Our animal being, with our skin and smells and lusts, become not just ignored, but banished and walled away behind the social constructs, or drowned out by the artificial body coverings and smells. This is similar to the thesis behind Ian McGilchrist's powerful book, The Master and His Emissary, about how the analytic left brain has taken over functions that are more the province of the right brain. If we go to the cultural or relational aspects too quickly in therapy, we will miss the basic fact of disconnection of our physical sexuality. And then all we're left with are the stories. We could say even that in those circumstances, all sex is a kind of pornography rather than a sexual intimacy. In this way, we can lose sight of the beast, the animal, and coral much of our libidinal power and energy. We gain a sense of control of the beast. Paradoxically, since it is actually always us doing what we are doing, the sense of being out of control always implies that we have disowned the I that is doing what we are doing. It is important to be aware that the beast is dangerous and without ethical sense. Yet the disowning and replacement of sexuality by narrative is also dangerous and can lead to, for example, rape or submissiveness or genital mutilation as expressions of masculinity or femininity or power, or as religious or political statements and actions. So the disconnection of the two is dangerous, whichever side that you take. So with this background, what is the place of sexuality in therapy? This seems like an important question to me, and one that is easily avoided by an unspoken collusion between therapist and client. If I engage in exploration of sexuality with clients who've previously had therapy, they will often tell me that this was never engaged with in other therapies. Both therapist and client are frightened of the power of sexuality. But it is never, it seems to me, a good idea to take the most powerful and frightening thing and say, therefore, we won't look at it. Because very often it is, usually it is those frightening and powerful things that at some level bring the person to therapy. And that's certainly what Freud said about sexuality. Therapists frequently take the ethical prohibition on sexual contact with clients as a taboo on the therapist that closes down any exploration of sexuality, and clients take it as a prohibition for themselves as well. This is the reverse of the meaning of the prohibition, which is to support the exploration of sexual themes in therapy and to differentiate this from sexual gratification and exploitation. It is because I will not have sex with my clients that we can safely explore sexual attraction and sexual desire. And I know where the boundary is, and the client doesn't have to hold the boundary because I will. The Gestalt couples therapist, Stella Resnick, has recently produced a book. And in that book, she questions why couples therapy and sex therapy have so often been separated. When sex is always a way couples express both their relationship and their difficulties. Even couples where there is no sex, that is a form of sexual expression. I hold the same viewpoint in this as Wilhelm Reich. And this is a quote from a book about Reich by Sharaf. Reich saw the reactivated infantile conflicts in the form of a psychoneurosis as further impeding adult genital function, thereby intensifying the actual neuroses, and so on in an endless vicious circle. However, there was also the possibility of a beneficent circle, of fulfilled sexual life with no actual neurosis could lead to withdrawal of energy from early childhood conflicts. That is, the problems people come to therapy about will always show themselves in their sexual functioning and in their insecurities around their sexual functioning. And those insecurities will help to lock those problems in place. While the establishment of an energetic, embodied, and uninterrupted sexual relationship would do much to move beyond the person's habitual physical and relational stuckness. We have all known situations, usually at first hand at some stages in our lives, when insecurity in building relationship leads to a fear that the other person will be dissatisfied, And this anxiety itself further interrupts the instinctive physical sexual drive. But conversely, people who come out of themselves when they first experience a sexual relationship that is powerful enough to put those insecurities into the background. In many cases, that original discovery involves teenage hormones, alcohol, whatever is needed. But whatever it is, we discover something which is powerful enough to pull us into a world which was not the world of our parental family. And Reich calls this ability to move into this new world of powerful and uninterrupted physical relationship, he called it orgastic potency. But it is very often true that clients, including couples in therapy, do not bring their sexual functioning to therapy, either because they are embarrassed, or they bring cultural interjects that it is not polite to do so, or because they get a sense that the therapist is embarrassed and would rather avoid the subject. And this is often accurate. Clients desexualize the therapist, again supported by a therapist who believes it is unethical to act in any way in the therapy situation that shows him to be a sexual being. So it becomes possible that people can complete a therapy and leave while their sexual functioning is still disrupted and even undermining of the progress made elsewhere. I want to make a kind of detour here and come back to something I said earlier. For Freud, the id drives, including primarily sexuality, faces the demands, the repressive demands of the superego. And the ego develops as a kind of referee of that conflict. And the ego finds a way through, which involves finding acceptable ways of being sexual, or ways of sublimating the sexual urge into other kinds of relating, whether it's sport or intellectual discussion or whatever. Pearl said, no, this is not what happens. He said that the superego, the demands introjected from society, come along with another pole, which he called the infraego. Later he called those the top dog and underdog. And the infraego is another construct that it forms to fight the superego. So the superego says you must, and the infraego says I can't, or I'll do it tomorrow, or doesn't hear, or find some clever way around. The point of the difference between what Pearl said and what Freud said is that neither the superego nor the infraego, the top dog nor the underdog, are connected with the id drives. He called them two puppets who perform their puppet show. And meanwhile, what gets lost is our feelings, our desires, our instincts. So I think this is a really good restatement. And I find it quite funny that when I speak to psychoanalytic colleagues and tell them about this change in the theory, they get quite thoughtful and say, yes, that makes sense. But as it applies to sexuality, it says that when we perform our top dog, underdog thing about sex, it has nothing to do with our drives. It becomes a set of narrative conflicts, romantic literature, rather than anything to do with our bodily lusts and desires for sex. So all this avoidance of sex and avoidance of sex in therapy, as well as other places, is particularly true if the client brings a history of sexual abuse or rape. It is vanishingly unlikely that this would not have an impact on the client's ability for full sexual expression. Yet, of course, it is an area that is very difficult to speak about and even more difficult to embody in the therapy situation. Yet, I believe that makes it even more important, and that if the therapist doesn't find a way to engage with the client's injured sexuality, is a collusion in the sexual victimization of the client. The abuser or the rapist says, your sexuality is here for my use and my use only. And the person feels that their sexuality has been taken away from them. And it is very easy for the therapist to collude in that taking away and saying, yes, it's gone, that's it. In the end, every person develops their sexuality in the context of their family and childhood situation, or all the interjects and actions and support and abuse of the person, the child, as a developing sexual being. And then every person needs to move away from that very limited context to find their own authentic and satisfying adult sexual expression, which is unlikely to be exactly what their parents did. But some people continue their parental experience, whether it is about limitation or oppression or abusive activity. It is, of course, more difficult and painful for someone whose original context in the family was abusive, but the need remains unless we believe that this disturbance is one that can never be healed. But I'm glad to say that this has not been my experience in therapy. In the same way, clients can get back in touch with their physicality and sexuality in therapy, and then bring that out of the therapy situation into their lives. Precisely because the therapist does what a good parent should do and allows the development of that sexuality and supports it, but doesn't gratify their sexual needs any more than parents should. And eventually, the dissatisfaction with that it leads to the client giving up on getting their sexual needs from their parents or their therapist and find their sexual contact in their world. The work is not just cognitive or about relationship, but about the here and now, physical, animal, sexual experiencing between therapist and client, about coming back in touch with their desire and their instinctive movements, physical movements towards satisfying their desire. And of course, I can only support that if I, as a therapist, am in touch with it myself and can hold that awareness of myself as a sexual being alongside clients, alongside my ethical boundaries. And that means something about how we engage physically with clients, whether we're just sitting down talking to each other, or whether we are open to these physical movements. I'll say more about that later. So, some examples from my practice, and please be aware in this that the clients could be a variety of gender and sexuality. So a client saying to me at the beginning of therapy, I'm frightened of sex, but I know that I'm safe with you because I know you're not going to have sex with me. So my response would be something like, let's slow this down. You are saying that possible sexual relating with me is a major issue for you. And at the same time, saying we won't go there. But I don't want to lock us out of exploring this. And even from acknowledging that we could have sex and all the feelings that go along with that. I'm an ethical therapist and will hold the boundary, but you will have to face questions of whether you will trust me to do that. And there is no code of ethics sexually for you. And I'm willing to hear your sexual responding to me. And I will hold the boundary for you to do that. Now, this is anxiety producing for both therapist and client, but otherwise we have set up an agreement that a major issue for the client is never going to come into our therapy. It may be that we are unable to fully work through these issues, and maybe the client needs at some stage to go to a therapist of a different gender, for example. But I'm not willing for us to leave sexuality out by default and without acknowledgement. So another example, and this one, I take the initiative. I'm curious about, so I say to the client, I'm curious about something. I'm very much interested in embodied therapy, but I find that it is almost impossible to even think about touching you. This seems important to me, and I don't want to just not touch the not touching. And this has more than once opened very important work, as a result of which people rekindled their sexual relating. But in general, when I first say it, the client looks at me and doesn't really understand what I'm saying. An opposite example, the client saying to me, I desperately want to have sex with you. So we can explore what that means and what it means for the client to say that to me, what it means for the client that I'm not going to have sex with them. But I remember in one situation, it kept on going, and the client kept on bringing it up. So eventually I said, and if we did have sex, then what? And the client laughed and said, then we wouldn't have to do therapy. This client didn't mention having sex again. I also had a very interesting experience around this third example. I described it to a senior Gestalt trainer who got very worried and checked that I wasn't having sex with the client. Of course, I wasn't. That was the whole point. In this case, the client became clear that the sex was a wish for intimacy, but at the same time, a deflection from the greater anxiety of doing the therapy. But I'm also aware that twice false rumors have gone around that I do exploit clients sexually. And I guess this is the way a reaction formation works. I give sexuality full weight in therapy rather than intellectualizing it or burying it. And that brings with it, in this polarized culture, a sense in some other people that I'm potentially an unethical therapist. So it really is something to approach with anxiety. And Goodman wrote about this in Pearls Hefferline and Goodman, that it is also a reduction of sex to see it, rather than being dirty, seeing it as being clean and healthy and just bright and wonderful. It is energetic and wonderful and dirty and dangerous and a big thing in life. So I think there are many training needs for therapists who are willing to work with sexuality. As I said before, therapists need to have attended therapeutically to their own sexuality and embodiment, and also to be able to make their own sexual relating. They will also need to have worked through their cultural introjects around showing themselves as sexual beings, including around using words for sexual acts and parts of the body, what's called in English, talking dirty. Clients will be very susceptible to picking up the therapist's embarrassment in this area. The need to have worked through cultural introjects around sexuality is particularly important when working in multicultural societies, because the clients will not necessarily be bringing the same introjects. And we need to be able to hold an understanding of how sexuality appears to our client in their cultural context, not necessarily in mine. Another highly important area is looking, being able to look at the client as a sexual being, or being able just to look at the client. In some cultures, looking at a client is looking directly at somebody is forbidden or is very uncomfortable. I believe that the culturally expected therapeutic setup, sitting in chairs and looking into each other's eyes, has an inhibitory function as much as a supportive one. If I look deeply into a client's eyes, I'm not looking anywhere else. If we sit all the time, our hips are held away from each other and protected, often also by arms, crossed legs, and cushions, or notebooks in a training and supervising context. I will often say to a client where I think this is likely to be an issue, what is it like for me that I'm looking at you? Also, if a client is not looking at me, then that's something that we could explore. Sometimes if it's overwhelmingly difficult for a client, I might suggest that they look away and then take a very quick look towards me and look away again, and that they keep on doing that. So it is a whole area of difficult, frightening, and dangerous exploration, partly because of the dangerous power of sex, and partly because of the suppressive power of culture, which again goes back to the instinctual power of sex, which needs to be controlled. In the sexuality area, as in any other area, the retroflexion itself shows the power of the desire. We only protect ourselves from things that we at another level are drawn towards and have an interest in. So back to Freud again. Freud said that fears are also wishes. Unless we have some sense of something being potentially in our lives, we don't fear it. I don't fear walking along a busy motorway, even though it's dangerous, because I have no desire to do it. All retroflexion starts with and is energized by the energy of desire, sexual or other. But it is tempting to focus just on the defense and the fear rather than the desire, because paradoxically, the defense and the fear are less frightening than the desire. It's not a matter of dropping one or the other, or of repressing one or the other. So I say to clients, which do you want to make figural, the desire or the anxiety? Because both are inevitably present, and our next moment is going to be very different depending on which at this moment we make figural and which we make background. And then there is touch. Again, I don't mean thinking about touch, but about our potential to touch in various ways, physically and sexually. Children in safe environments explore this naturally with their parents and siblings, and later with their teachers and their school friends. If that was inhibited or unsafe, they will need to find other places to do that developmental exploration. My understanding is that if a client has assimilated a reasonable amount of actual, safe, and intimate touch, they can evoke that sense by fantasy and words. If they have not had that opportunity to assimilate, or if their assimilation is of touch as rejecting or painful, they cannot replace that experience with fantasy, because the fantasy follows their imagination. It doesn't, or their unsafe experience, rather than the actuality. This leads to one of the most complex things in working on sexuality with clients. Of course, as a therapist, I do not want to force sexual touch or sexual exploration on clients, especially when they have been forced into sexual expression in other parts of their lives. But it is precisely with those clients that if I ask, is it okay to touch you, that they will say no, but not because they are afraid of touch, even though they think they are. I've said this before in these webinars. When clients say, I'm scared of doing something, it is usually not true. The truth is, they're scared of their fantasy of what it would be like to do that. But they will never lose that fantasy unless they try and then discover that it is different from what they imagined it would be. I've spoken about the child who is frightened of the monster under the bed, and talking in fantasy about the monster makes the monster even more frightening. We'll have to hold hands with a parent and go under the bed and discover that the monster isn't there. But in doing that, we risk having our heads bitten off by the monster. So that leads, in terms of sexual exploration, to a very fine balance where I will neither force a client to do any particular exploration, and neither will I just drop it because the client says, no, I don't want to do this. This is the second example I gave earlier. If the clients who have been terrified out of their sexual possibilities, if I took no, I don't want to do this as a boundary that I will not go near that again, then we can never go further with this. And I need to be able to express precisely that to the client. No, I'm not going to force you into anything, but no, I'm not going to drop it. And in fact, your strong wish that I leave this topic and I go somewhere else must in itself become a topic of therapy, because it is precisely what we do in therapy, that people bring difficulties that they've experienced in their lives into therapy, and it shows itself in the therapeutic relationship, and we must stay with that. And the same thing is true of sexual expression. We must get beyond being either the top dog to the client's underdog, or the underdog to the client's top dog. We need to stay with the reality that we are animals with a powerful sexual drive, and that will express itself whether it is in our expression of it, or our repression of it, or our avoidance of it. And that will take away from the client's relating and the client's life. So in the background to all that I've been saying is a wish to get rid of polarization between drive and relationship, between Leib and Körper, between instinct and ethics. They are all characters in this field, and the whole point about relating in this field is that all of those will be enacted in various ways, either to enhance each other or to conflict with each other. And then the most difficult conflicts are the ones which we never express outwards, just enact within ourselves as internal battles that take us away from relating to the world and to other people. If we suppress exploration of sexuality through anxiety, the person who suffers will be the client. But it will also put a constraint on the whole movement and energy available in therapy, as does any neurotic repression that there isn't the support developed between us to face. So this is what I want to say today about sexuality, drive and relationship. I'm aware in a slightly comical way that next week's webinar is about shame and guilt, so that's probably appropriate. So I suggest we have about 10 minutes break and then have a discussion about what I've said, questions, case examples, what to do in particular situations. So thank you for listening, and thank you to the translators for translating. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, we may as well start, and then people will come back.
I can ask, yes, that's the moment.
Yep.
I have such a question. I'm the student of a second stage, but we have a task there. We have to have a case client for about 10 sessions. My first client was a girl, and she came to our third encounter. Well, she is an attractive girl. She got shapes, and she came to the third encounter, and she had such a skirt with this line, and she also had a blouse, well, making, well, and it was very expressive, and I was at a loss. I don't know what to do in such situations, and I was bewildered, but I didn't dare to ask her. Well, I don't know what to do in such kind of situations. She had a cleavage, very expressive cleavage on her blouse.
Okay. I know I have said to women clients before that I've found it difficult to keep attention because she was wearing a very short dress, or sat with her legs up, or lots of cleavage, and that I would be interested in whether the client is in some ways trying to be seductive with me, but I would also ask the client maybe to wear something different, to say, you know, there's nothing wrong with showing yourself in that way, but I find it difficult to stay being a therapist that way. So in speaking about it in that way, I would be bringing my own sexual response in, but and acknowledging that I did have a response, but that I didn't find that helpful. So could we adjust it so that she changed what she wore? And I found that the most useful thing.
I got it. Thank you.
Is that okay to ask a question? Peter,
Виктория, пожалуйста, на русском.
Oh, Victoria, please, could you switch on to Russian?
Хорошо.
Yeah, okay, then. The interpretation settings.
Было бы, пожалуйста, немножко больше.
I would be interested.
She's on the English channel, I think, so it's actually quite.
Can I speak English? That would be
yeah,
easier.
it's probably, if she's on the English channel, it's best if she speaks English and the Russian interpreter interprets.
Does that work? It works for me.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, Victoria.
Thank you. I just feel that I need a bit more clarity about the boundary that you were talking about earlier. You mentioned, you gave an example in your lecture of a client who said that, I can't remember exactly, that he was talking about sexuality with you because you were not going to have sex with him or her, right?
Yeah.
And I remember you saying at that point that you were going to keep the boundary, right? Yes. And yet take the sexuality into work. And here, yes, for me, something just doesn't click. Isn't the fact that me as a therapist, so that I'm bound by the ethics, that we are not going to have sex, that's kind of for sure, right?
Yeah.
So apart from that, what kind of boundary then are we talking about? Could you maybe say a bit more about this? What boundary are you keeping here, and how does it make it all feel safe for the client or not?
Well, first of all, it's not going to feel safe for the client or for the therapist, but the essence of therapy is mostly about going into areas that don't feel safe and for providing the support to go into the areas that don't feel safe. And the boundary is that I will not have sex with this client, but we can still explore our potential to have sex and all that brings up, because that would be a safe place to do that. if that boundary goes into a boundary that we can't even explore it, then where is the client going to find their safe place to explore their potential sexual relating? In the end, what I want is a situation where clients can find their own adult sexual expression in the world, not with me, but in the world. And if everything else has been done in the therapy, but the client still is out of contact with their sexuality and too frightened to engage in the world with it, then the therapy is incomplete. Doesn't mean it will necessarily always be able to be completed in this or any other area, but I would be aware of the incompleteness of it. So the boundaries must be loose enough that we can do that exploration in a safe way. And the safety is provided 99% by the therapist, because there is no ethical injunction that clients cannot express their sexual attraction towards the therapist or their urgent desire to have sex with the therapist or anything like that. These are all perfectly good client expressions. And even if it's with regret, and sometimes it's useful for a client, for the therapist to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to have sex with you. And I feel some regret about that. Then the client can actually know that at least somebody finds them desirable. And the boundary for me is to allow that kind of exploration to happen rather than to make it impossible.
Thank you.
No, Елена, у вас есть вопрос?
So, Yelena, you've got a question. I resonated with your response to the previous question about the therapist when a woman wore sexy dress and the therapist was aroused. Well, to my mind, if the therapist tells me or responds to me by saying, could you please wear something different? To my mind, it may evoke the following understanding of the client. The client may believe that the therapist has no control over his own emotions and feelings and own expressions, and this may provoke also the fantasies about even greater prominence and significance of my sexuality. I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought. Okay, but in such cases, when we are talking about sexuality with the client and demonstrating our interest, I think that as a therapist, the therapist should reconsider, well, the reason why maybe the therapist was the one who evoked, who provoked the client to demonstrate the sexuality to him. Maybe some words or some actions of the therapist evoked such a reaction, because sometimes the client in a disguised way expresses such kind of gratitude to the therapist by doing this. And very often when this happens, vice versa, I'm losing words, failing to find words because I'm very nervous. And when everything is destructive, then we perceive our love the same way as our sexuality. And then in this case, how can we catch the fact that the client has gratitude for you, but this gratitude is disguised in certain sexual flows? Thank you.
I think if that is the process, that the person sexualizes their gratitude or their desire, that I would want that to come into the therapy. And I don't see that as being wrong in any way. That'll have a history to it as well. But there's a more basic thing, which is we're not in control of our sexual response. We're not in general in control of our emotions. Our emotions and our sexual responding and our physical responding is an immediate response, organismic response to our environment. What we do with it, we have some control over, and that's where ethics comes in. But I've had erections with clients, and I don't choose that. It's embarrassing, but it's there, and maybe the client picks it up, but that's part of human functioning. However much we would try and avoid that, the ethics allow us to talk about that and to bring it into the exploration. But if I do bring it in, like I suggested to Vladislav, that the client could have several reactions. They could feel ashamed. They could feel tempted. They could feel all sorts of things. But we still need to stay with it, because one of the things I would want to go back to is that though we can pretend not to, we are very physically attuned to sexual arousal in people around us. And particularly those who have had dangerous sexual experiences in the past are very attuned to it. So they will know. And we can pretend to each other that we don't know and that we don't talk about it. But those clients will know. So if it's there, and if it's important between us, and if there is some way, for whatever reason, that the client is trying to dress to invoke those responses, either in me or in everybody, she might wear those clothes everywhere. Then we need to talk about it. But then there's a final part of all this. Walter Kempler, in his book Principles of Gestalt Family Therapy, was talking about therapist self-disclosure. And he said that there were only 2 reasons for a therapist to self-disclose. One is if the disclosure would move the therapy on. And the other is whether or not it moves the therapy on, if the therapist needs to say it in order to stay in contact. And if the way that a client dresses or sits makes it difficult for me to make something other than my sexual response figural, I need to speak about that. Because if I don't speak about it, maybe the client will feel better about it not having been mentioned, but they will have a therapist who is only slightly present. And that would be much more damaging to the therapy. But in general, if somebody wears clothes like that to therapy, that there's a statement there which needs to be explored as much as anything else. The other thing, and it's not just clients, I've had supervisees who come in similar kind of revealing clothes, and I check, do you wear those clothes with clients? And sometimes they do. So what does it mean when the therapist is trying to arouse the client? That's even more complicated, but again, it needs to be spoken of. And it's not that it's not there if it's not spoken of. The not speaking of it is part of something which both people know is there. Okay.
Есть вопрос от Елены.
We have one more question from Elena in our chat. So what should we discuss if the client is talking about her feeling of love about me? She's thinking about me, offers me gifts. What should we explore here? I have an idea that that's a reflection, but maybe there could be some other aspects to discuss. I have consulted the supervisor. Maybe there is the expression of unsatisfied sexuality. She lacks love and she lacks presence from her surroundings, from her people around.
It might be just that the client loves the therapist. And has finally found somebody who it is safe to express their love. And that's not uncommon. And it's something that Freud certainly wrote about a lot. And all I would want to do is to say thank you. It's really nice to hear. I would also want to say that I do not need gifts, that the expression of the love in itself is a gift, and that I'm there even if she doesn't give gifts, or he. Then if there are some other elements that I get a sense, as you say, that this client is reflecting and that they're wanting to be loved, I might bring that in. But I'm not going to pretend something I don't feel, even if the client wants it. I'm not going to sort of dig deep in myself to find loving feelings similar to what the client has. Because the most central thing that I have to offer is the truthfulness and reality of myself in a way that is trustworthy, especially with people who have been living among untrustworthy people. So I don't want to assume it's that. It's just as important that the client finally has somebody that they feel a profound, intense attachment to, and they feel that as love. And all I need to do is to hear it and thank them. I would add that this is also very basic for me in terms of therapy, that people say things, whether it's that they're in love or that they're angry or that they're frightened. They say that for the first time to the therapist because they've now found somebody safe enough to do that with. And having done that, they find it easier to take that out of the therapy room and to say it to other people. So I've got a funny example of that. which is a man who was in a therapy group. And after 5 sessions, which is a minimum membership in my groups, he said, "This is my last night. There's nothing wrong with what you do. I like you, but you're not what I want in my life now." So he seemed very clear. He said his goodbyes to people and went off. And a bit later, I got a letter from him, and it said, "Thank you, Peter. The therapy's changed my life." I never said that to anybody before. There's nothing wrong with you, but you're not what I want in my life now. I've now said it to some other people, and my life is very different. So this is, for me, it's got all the extra anxieties to do with drives and sexuality and things like that, but it is just very standard. Somebody feels love and feels safe enough to express love. And then my experience is that in staying with that and accepting that, they then find it easier to say it to other people, where things can happen that can't happen with the therapist. So it's better than saying it to the therapist, but they've got to start off by saying it to the therapist. Elena.
Можно продолжить? Да, могу это задать вопрос? Питер, я думаю, вот про ту в начале лекции.
So can I continue? I also wanted to ask a question. Actually, at the beginning of the lecture, you said that this animal component of ours, our id, is being inhibited, that, you know, it's sometimes not expressed in therapy in any form. And can you elaborate on it a little bit? How can it express itself? How do we spend time working on it? What were you addressing when you were mentioning it? Thank you very much.
Okay. Sexuality is one that I've been talking about. The other one which comes to my mind, another major drive, is about eating, working with people with eating disorders. For me, the whole process about working with people with anorexia is a denial of the animal. I remember a woman I was working with who was dangerously thin and starving herself in a very dangerous way. Came in one day very agitated, said, "Peter, you've got to help me. I'm eating like an animal." And I was really pleased, because it meant that she maybe would not starve to death, which she didn't. But it was that she was now an animal, and whether it's about the drive to sex, the drive to eat, the drive to breathe, the drive to move. Clients who sit very still, and Bob Resnick says awareness implies movement. So if people don't move, then they lose an awareness of their bodies. By the way, everybody keep moving around, otherwise you lose an awareness of your body in this sort of setting. All of these need to be part of the therapy. Therapy can't just be about words and about thoughts and about fantasies. It must be about movement, about breathing, about touch, about contact with the ground, about all those things. And then it's therapy which includes the animal. But the therapy culture has developed various ways of pushing the animal aside. And the thing about sitting down and looking into each other's eyes for long periods is part of that. I mean, and it doesn't arise from Freud. Freud's patients and Pearl's in his early days as a therapist was lying down in a very physically open and vulnerable place, and one where they could move. If somebody's sitting in a chair, it is actually quite difficult to move. Your hips are constrained, your movement is constrained in a way that was not true for Freud's patients.
Спасибо. Правильно ли я понимаю, что
So thank you very much. Do I get in it right that we should add movement and focus in attention on the way people feel, they breathe, what's going on the level of sensation? So that's what you were referring to.
Absolutely, and of touch. As I said, the people who have the most difficulties in terms of touch are the ones who would not be able to feel the therapist touching them just from kindly expressions and things like that, because they don't have the assimilated background of feeling what good touch feels like that they could bring to that. So some people that therapy must involve touch, actual touch, actual movement of dancing together. I've used that in other webinars, the idea that we find our dance together, including physically, doing a physical dance. It's a holistic therapy, Gestalt therapy. It isn't a mental therapy.
Можно задать вопрос?
So can I ask you a question?
Okay.
Спасибо. Если, например,
Thank you very much. So let's say if some sexual moments are not in the focus of discussions with the client, and there is no provocative revealing clothes, there is no provocative behavior, but at the same time there is this flirtatious ambiance, let's say between the therapist and the patient. What should we do with that? And do we need to make the subject of discussion? I mean, how do we handle it? That's my question.
Okay. We could play with flirting. I mean, I really enjoy flirting. And we could look sideways at each other and do the dance of flirtation together and explore that dance. It can be incredible fun. It provides a place for a client to do that with a therapist who isn't scared of flirting, who is willing to go into that way of playing together as well.
I wonder whether it will ignite the client's expectations of certain kinds, or whether it will lead to some shared frightfulness of making the next move. I mean, not moving into a relationship, but to some deeper exploration of some topics. I mean, I wonder whether there is this fear that all of these things may lead to a deeper level of mutual interest.
Yes, it might. But phenomenologically, that's where it goes. And I will still hold the boundary and I won't enter a sexual relationship. But what expectations a client would bring to that would be part of the therapy either way, whichever way it goes. I'm thinking of one woman client I worked with where there was an incredibly strong ambivalence. So she really showed herself as wanting touch and wanting physical closeness. But then there was a moment as we moved closer to each other when she suddenly switched. And I suddenly felt myself as an abuser. So we just spent a long time exploring that, and there was lots of history caught up in that. And we explored that. And she brought something quite remarkable because she really came to a strong awareness of this ambivalence. And she brought a photograph she'd taken, a selfie. And in that selfie, she was standing up, she was naked, and she had a piece of computer fanfold paper in front of her, covering her whole body, but leaving out enough to show that behind that she was naked, and that was enough for a lot of therapy, and all sorts of things about her life, both historically and in her present relationships came out from that.
Спасибо.
Thanks. So I wonder if I could also ask a question. Hello, good evening. Hi, Peter. So my question goes as follows. So if we deal with, let's say, a person being desensitized, let's say they do not feel any touch, they don't feel touch on their skin at all. I wonder whether you use this same approach where you would encourage the client to touch themselves. Let's say if you have a session online remotely, do you encourage the clients to touch themselves as a way to feel the touch?
Yes.
So how do they feel, right, in their hands with which they're touching themselves, and how do they experience it in their skin? Thanks.
Okay. I have a thing that I regularly do with people who are disembodied, and again, this includes people with anorexia, who are very commonly like this. And you might want to try this. I get them to fairly firmly, so that they can go on feeling it afterwards. If you do very gentle touch, they won't feel it, but they usually need something firmer. There's again an instinct, a drive towards that, And the people who are very disembodied will very often do things to feel pain. They cut themselves or provoke people to attack them or something like that. There's an instinctive sense that they are floating, which they don't like. They want to ground themselves. And all the evidence is that cutting is not about self-punishment, but about resensitizing. When they cut and they feel the sting and they see the blood, they relax and they feel better. And it's not the best way of doing it, but getting them to do this is fine. If it's in a group, there's another way of doing it, which is that people ask other people in the group to do that for them. They lie down and they choose the people to tap or whatever, and the people they ask can say no. So it's with mutual agreement both ways. And very often their vision is brighter and clearer. They feel more themselves. Strong emotion can come out when they do that. The other thing, even online, sometimes you can create an impression of touch because we all have functioning mirror neurons. So if I do that, people can feel themselves being touched through their mirror neurons. So, there are various ways of doing it. But I remember one woman saying, I need to be loved in a way that I will go on feeling afterwards. If it's too gentle, I won't feel it.
Спасибо. Моим
Thank you. Right, so I've been in my private practice for 2 years, and I noticed that during panic attacks, people feel almost no touch. They're very desensitized, and it's a very good working technique. And they seem to be in their heads, when they're out of their bodies, metaphorically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the body then gradually comes out. It withdraws and then it comes out.
Yeah.
And my client said that she really felt revived.
Mm-hmm.
Something you've just said.
Yes. I remember working with a businessman who joined a group, and he told me that he had panic attacks all the time, but that he was very skilled at not showing people that he was having a panic attack. And one of the most important therapeutic moments was when he could say to the group, I'm having a panic attack now. He'd never been able to tell people that, and that was part of the turning inwards and desensitizing.
Есть вопрос в чате от Анатолия.
Right, so we have a question in our chat as well. So how can the therapist be of help to the client that considers herself an immature woman, kind of a broken woman who has very poor understanding of men?
Well, the first thing in my case is that she's saying this to a man. So one possibility is there anything you want to ask me? So that would be one place we can go, and I would be open to answering some questions, and some questions I would hold the right to say no, I don't want to answer that. But all maturity starts with immaturity. Everybody who does things easily starts off doing it badly or with difficulty. When we learn to stand, when we learn to feed ourselves, when we learn to use a toilet, we always start off doing it badly, and then we get better. So how can I support this path from a sense of immaturity to a sense of maturity, which is something which is there for everybody, although some people have assimilated more support for moving from immaturity to maturity. So how would I best support you to do that? And the other bit of it is that going into a sexual relationship or an intimate relationship or friendship of any kind is a frightening thing, because you're making yourself vulnerable. You might get hurt. Some people know that they might get hurt because they've had a lot of experience of that. And to try and convince them that if they do it better, that they won't get hurt is just, it seems to me, wrong. To go into any kind of relationship where you make yourself vulnerable is an act of courage. And what's needed is support for the courage and support for the hurt if it then hurts. When I work with people who have never had a satisfying sexual relationship, and then they start being able to find that, my hope is that they have a wonderful experience. But whose first relationships are a wonderful experience? That part of it is that I need to be aware that they are going to have pleasures, they're going to have disappointments, and they just need support to be with all of those. We're just about done, I think. Maybe one more question, or maybe finish, I don't know which. Elena, you had another.
Да, я хотела бы задать вам вопрос.
Right, I would like to ask you a question. So one of my clients started seeking my help. She had a problem. The feelings, things cooled off between her and her husband. She didn't feel sexual. So we had a lot of sessions exploring this, and we eliminated, what stood in the way. But it turned out that she likes this state. I mean, she likes being sexual in the new relationship and feeling significant. But, you know, to say to her that if you have it, keep seeking it, you know, because in the current relationship, because otherwise it leads to the endless search for a new partner. So when I asked her whether she loved her husband, she said, I love him and I respect him, and I want to have my feelings to him and not to someone else. I also worked with a spouse, and it's an absolutely normal man that can give her something she wants. But I wonder, how do I, as a therapist, whether there are any practices, how shall I ignite her emotional sensitivity to herself? Because first and foremost, she has to experience her own sexuality in the relationship with herself.
Well, she experiences her own sexuality by her experience of who she's attracted to, because sexuality is not about concepts so sometimes people stop being attracted to their partners. You know, people, I've been in a relationship for a very long time, and our expression with each other over the years has changed. We've each changed. And there's a potential that's no longer satisfying. And it's not for a therapist to try and make our sexuality fit in with what it should be. They could discuss it, and they could decide that for the love they have for each other, to find what expression of that physically fits between the two of them. That would be a fine thing to do. Just say, I'm now ready to leave this sexual relationship and find that elsewhere, and still stay friends if that's possible with you. That's also okay. It isn't for the therapist to try and mold the sexuality towards some convention, because that isn't what sexuality is. People then have to decide what they do with it. And the therapist is there as a support for whatever is given up and for whatever is held on to. So that's my view. Okay, we need to finish. And thank you for the translation, and see some of you at least next week. I hope I'll be feeling better. So all the best.